Welcome to episode 261 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. I am your host, Kim Newlove. Today, I am celebrating 4 years in podcasting. I consider my podcast anniversary to be the last solo show in January every year. Anything on or around January 25th works for me because even though I launched this podcast in December of 2019, I didn't start a regular weekly schedule until episode 2, which was January 25th, 2020. That's where I get January 25th from. Each podcast anniversary episode is a little different. If you want to check out my first, second, and third podcast anniversary episodes, links to all of those are in the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. Click on the podcast tab and then find episode 261. For this podcast anniversary episode, I want to start with some gratitude. I would not be 4 years into this podcast without an audience. If no one listened, this podcast would not exist. I would have given up long ago. So thank you for listening. The download numbers from you, my audience, have helped me make some choices for year 5 that is coming up for this podcast. We'll get into that in just a few minutes. But while we're still on the topic of gratitude, I want to say that my guests have been a very important part of the success of this podcast, and I am thankful for them. They freely give their time and share their talents with all of us. I am thankful for my guests. If you're listening to this and you have ever been part of this show, thank you for being my guest. Next up, I plan to talk about 2 topics. One is statistics, and the other is the future of this podcast. After that, I'll wrap this episode up. All right, let's get into the statistics. I am not obsessed with numbers as a podcaster, just so you know. I am a pharmacist by training, and I like data because of that. Even though I'm officially a voice actor and a podcast host, the part of me that is very much still a pharmacist knows that the pharmacy professionals in my audience love numbers too. So let's get into the stats. I have downloads on my YouTube channel, my website, and the podcast players, at least 3 places. And it's really hard for me to tease all of those 3 apart. But I'll tell you what I know. On the podcast players and my website combined, I have more than 42,000 unique downloads. If you are listening to this on a podcast player or my website, thank you for listening. Now let's talk about the YouTube stats. I started my YouTube channel in 2021. I have 180 subscribers and more than 8,600 views. Understanding YouTube stats is not my forte. But all of my podcast episodes are on YouTube, and they all get views or downloads, whatever terminology you want to use. Some of my YouTube-only videos also get downloads. I am not sure how much of that 8,600 views is just for my podcast episodes. The point here is that people are listening to my podcast on YouTube. More people check out the podcast episodes on YouTube than they watch the YouTube videos that I post, just for your information. If you have a podcast, now this I'm talking to future podcasters or current podcasters, if you are thinking of starting a podcast or you have a podcast, syndicate your podcast episodes to YouTube. People want to listen to you there. They are listening to me on my YouTube channel. And if you're listening to this on YouTube right now, thank you for listening. As far as where people are listening, I only have a list of countries from the last 90 days. I wish I had it for the whole entire year of 2023, but I do not. I use Libsyn. They give great statistics, but apparently I only know how to access the last 90 days. The Pharmacist Voice podcast was downloaded in 51 countries in the last 90 days. Of those 51 countries, the countries with the top downloads were, and I'll go in reverse order to build the suspense, number 5, the UK, number 4, Germany, number 3, Thailand, number 2, Canada, and number 1 is the USA. Throughout the year, the countries with the top downloads are generally the United States and Canada at number 1 and number 2, and then another country typically shows up in 3rd place. usually a primarily English-speaking country like Australia or the UK. I've also seen India up there in the top 3 as well. Australia is usually in the top 5, but they didn't happen to make it in the top 5 that I just talked about, which have been from the last 90 days. Countries pop up on and off my radar too. Sometimes I have 60 or more countries tuning in the last 90 days. Other times it's less than 60, like today. The country that surprised me most in showing up in my data was Macau. If you don't know, Macau is the Las Vegas of the East. It's technically part of China, I believe. And sidebar conversation here. I first heard about Macau in the movie Crazy Rich Asians, which is a fantastic book and movie. I actually listened to the audiobook first. The names were easier for me to digest as an audiobook. There's a lot of Asian names, I'm sure you can imagine. Then I saw the movie in the theater. Great movie. Awkwafina is one of my favorite Asian American actresses, and she was awesome in Crazy Rich Asians. She made me laugh. Sidebar over, back to the stats. No matter where you tune in, thank you so much for listening. As far as numbers of episodes, I have published 261 podcast episodes of the Pharmacist Voice podcast, including today. It's about 50-50 on the type of show. I've got 130 solo shows and 131 interview shows, 261 episodes in total. The number of episodes per year has definitely varied. Here's a recap of the first 4 years. Year 1 had 80 episodes. That's including the 1-year celebration episode in January 2021. There were 54 solo shows and 26 interview shows. Year 2 had 52 episodes. That was including the 2-year celebration episode in January of 2022. There were 23 solo shows and 29 interview shows. Year 3 had 64 episodes, including the 3-year celebration episode in January of 2023. There were 24 solo shows and 40 interview shows. And year number 4 had 65 episodes. That's including today's 4-year celebration episode. There were 29 solo shows and 36 interview shows. That does it for my stats. Next up, let's talk about the future of this podcast. Pharmacists like plans. We learn about SOAP notes in pharmacy school, right? Subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. I am totally a SOAP note girl, through and through. Subjectively, I have things that I like doing or I want to do with this podcast. Objectively, the data shows that my audience likes it when I do a certain type of episode. For the assessment piece, I'm interpreting how the data should guide the future of this podcast. And I'm taking all of these thoughts and data and making a plan, which podcasters call a production schedule. Production schedules are important, and I definitely have a production schedule for this podcast. I am flexible to a point, but I have all of 2024 essentially planned out on my production schedule. What's the plan? I'm increasing the number of pronunciation episodes from 1 per month to 2 per month. The Pharmacist Podcasters Series will continue at a rate of once per month. And by the way, the guest list for that series is not complete yet. I'm holding a place in my production schedule for the actual episode, but if you're a pharmacist podcaster and you're interested in being part of the Pharmacist Podcasters Series on the Pharmacist Voice podcast, please message me through my website, thepharmacistvoice.com. Just click on the Contact tab, send me a message. Episode 4 of the Pharmacist Podcasters Series, by the way, comes out next Friday, January 26th. My guest is Dr. Christina Fontana. What else is on my production schedule for 2024? I've got seasonal updates where I talk about my family, my business, my podcast, and what I've been listening to, reading, watching, and playing. I love those episodes. Stay tuned for the winter episode that's coming up next month, my winter update in February. I'm keeping a poison prevention awareness episode in my production schedule for March and an autism awareness and acceptance episode in April. The Pharmacist Authors Series will return to the show in June, July, and August. I already have one guest on the schedule. I've only got 3 spots available. The one that I have scheduled is Dr. Steve Luke. He's a pharmacist, of course. The guest list for the series is not complete. If you're a pharmacist author and you're interested in being part of the Pharmacist Authors Series for 2024, contact me through my website. Veterans are also important to me, so I'm planning another interview with a Public Health Service Commissioned Corps pharmacist, or maybe another commissioned officer of some kind, Army, Navy, Air Force, for example. That will be for Veterans Day in November. We're getting towards the end of the list, I promise. I have 5 openings this production year that can be either a solo show or an interview show. One of those 5 episodes will be an interview with Matt Grissinger, RPH from ISMP. We'll be talking about a medication safety topic. The other 4 episodes that are open will be for me to promote my online courses, any business achievements I make, my newsletter, my free ebook that's coming up, or maybe I'll do a spontaneous interview. To be announced. And finally, the last thing that's on my production schedule for the year is my next podcast anniversary show. Now that this podcast anniversary show is out of the way, I will plan to publish another one next January. Celebrating milestones is important to me. Birthdays, anniversaries, podcasting milestones, they're all important, and I plan to celebrate my podcast anniversary every year. As we start to wrap this up, I want to say that I've learned a lot from my 4 years of podcasting by paying attention to what the audience likes, what I myself enjoy, and staying true to my why. I started this podcast as a business tool to help me with branding, marketing, networking, and relationship building. Not just relationships with potential clients or guests, but also a relationship with you, my audience. This podcast has been very good to me. And again, I appreciate you listening. Thank you. I'm excited for year 5. I should say that with more energy. I'm excited for year 5 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. And I'm looking forward to publishing 52 more episodes in my next production year. Thank you so much for listening to this year's podcast anniversary episode. This has been episode 261 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Please visit thepharmacistvoice.com to read the show notes. In the show notes, you'll find my other podcast anniversary episodes, links to my online courses, my social media links, and more. Please feel free to reach out and connect. If you know someone who would like this episode or might be interested in being a guest, please share this episode with them. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist Voice podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. Thanks again for listening today. I'll talk to you next Friday.